Alejo, disculpa, entonces en YouTube no hay todavía el icono para empezar la transmisión.
Ya lo van a poner, Norman. Entonces, por eso le pedí a Carlos que silenciara los micrófonos de nosotros aquí, porque él va, cuando empiece a retransmitir por YouTube, aparece el afiche del evento. Y a las 9:05 arrancamos aquí en la sala y en ese mismo momento arranca la transmisión por YouTube también.
Ah, bien.
Muy buenos días. ¿Me escuchan en este momento? Perfecto. Bueno, entonces Muy buenos días para todos. Eh, Bienvenidos a los estudiantes, a los profesores que nos acompañan hoy en este evento. Y eh, este evento es la lección inaugural de la tercera cohorte de la maestría en traducción. Y para mí, de verdad que es muy emocionante poder estar aquí con ustedes en este momento. Quisiera decir unas cuantas palabritas en inglés muy cortas porque tenemos un invitado de lujo. Espero que me disculpen si me equivoco de pronto en la pronunciación. eh, pueden ser los nervios, pero simplemente quisiera dar a cordial greeting to all of you and welcome to this event. It's an honor for me and for the School of Languages of the University of Antioquia to have the presence of Professor Donald C. Kirley, who joins us from Germany to give the inaugural lecture of the third cohort of the Master's Degree in Translation. Uh, Translator Education in the European Context, Past and Present. Es el título de la presentación que tendremos el placer, el gusto de escuchar hoy. Entonces, sin más preámbulos, yo le quiero dar la palabra a la persona que fue el puente, el vínculo con el profesor Kirali para poder tenerlo aquí hoy con nosotros, y es Norman Gómez, que ya entregó su tesis de doctorado, está próximo a defender, y quiero que sea Norman entonces quien nos presente al profesor Kirali antes de su lecture.
Bueno, Alejandro, muchas gracias a ti y también una bienvenida para todas las personas en esta presentación. Bueno, quiero ante todo presentar al profesor Kirali. Es siempre difícil resumir la larga trayectoria de experiencias y logros académicos e investigativos de una persona como el profesor Kirali en un solo par de minutos. Sin embargo, aquí están algunos de sus logros más notorios. El profesor Kirali ha dictado cursos de traducción, subtitulación, enseñanza de lenguas extranjeras y de lingüística aplicada en la Universidad de Mainz, de Maguncia, desde el año 1984. Y antes de esto, el profesor fue también docente de lenguas en Francia, en la ciudad de Lyon, en una facultad de ingeniería. Allí pudo perfeccionar su conocimiento del idioma francés. En una etapa posterior, el profesor Kirali también viajó a Francia como profesor visitante en la Universidad de la Sorbona, donde ocupó este cargo de profesor visitante por 3 años entre 2008 y 2012. Cabe anotar que aparte del inglés y el francés, el profesor Kirali también domina ampliamente el alemán y el español y tiene conocimiento de otra variedad de lenguas, de las cuales ha diseñado cursos universitarios mediante la implementación de su exitoso enfoque emergente de lenguas, o también conocido como Scaffolded Language Emergency. Bueno, tal vez el profesor nos hable un poco de esto durante sus presentaciones. El profesor también ha sido supervisor de numerosas tesis doctorales sobre la enseñanza de la traducción y también ha tenido más de 60 tesis de maestría bajo su supervisión en la Universidad de Maguncia en este largo tiempo de trabajo allí. Además de lo anterior, el profesor ha brindado también una gran cantidad de talleres y de conferencias sobre la traducción y la enseñanza a lo largo y ancho de toda Europa, y ha sido invitado como conferencista principal en un sinnúmero de eventos internacionales en las áreas de su especialidad. Entre sus publicaciones, el profesor cuenta con más de medio centenar de libros, capítulos y artículos académicos escritos en varios idiomas, en inglés, francés y alemán también. Y tal vez lo más reconocido son su trabajo monográfico, Pathways to Translation, que surgió a partir de su tesis doctoral. Y también es mundialmente conocido el libro A Social Constructivist Approach to Translation Education del año 2000. En este desarrolla su conocido enfoque socioconstructivista. Bueno, ya para terminar, el profesor también ha reflexionado ampliamente sobre la enseñanza de las lenguas y como producto de estas reflexiones ha producido libros en el tema del Scaffolded Language Emergency, versiones en inglés, italiano y español también. Tuve el honor de trabajar en la versión española con el profesor. Y bueno, a falta de más tiempo para hablar de los significativos aportes del profesor Kirali a la traducción y a la enseñanza, creo que es mejor ceder la palabra al profesor para que nos hable de su larga experiencia y de su conferencia. Profesor Kirali, muchas gracias por acompañarnos hoy y le cedo la palabra.
Thank you very much. Let's see if I can get we can switch pictures here. To me, yeah? Can you switch to my picture, Alejandro? Well, I can try sharing my screen.
Perfect, yeah.
Okay, good. As long as this works, that's the main thing. Let me just find the beginning. Play from the start. Okay. I notice the system likes to jump. There, it did it. Then I have to go back on this one. I don't think it happens again, but there are a couple little things I would like to improve in this presentation, but we're going to do with it what we can. Thank you very much for this lovely invitation to Antioquia, where I've never been. I've never been to Colombia either, but I have now friends in Colombia, and hope to actually come and visit your university at some point in the near future and see what you're doing. I've enjoyed viewing the videos online. I don't know if they were done by you or by other students in another department, but they were quite interesting, involving authentic projects and everything presented in English. I thought that was really very brave. And I don't think ever dared to do a presentation in a foreign language online. So I thought that's amazing to see so many students be willing to do that and go out on a limb, as it were, to do that. So what I'd like to do today is introduce what I want to talk about next week. I've been doing research on the teaching of translation now since around 1984 or 85, so somewhere around 35 years, and which even for me, it seems like a long, long time ago. And I think some of the slides I'm going to show you may come as a surprise to you, but they're constant reminders to me about how things change over time. Of course, a third of a century is a fair amount of time, but still, if you look at where technology has brought us in those 35 years, not only in the field of translation, but in every area of life where the computer has become an essential basic tool, like pencils and pens and erasers used to be, now we're using computers to do all sorts of things. I'll touch on this aspect of computer use because, of course, as a translator, I've had to use computers for many years now, not 35 years, because 35 years ago, we had no computers available to us as translators, at least not here in Germany. So I would do my translations on a typewriter. I would receive the text through the mail, I would translate, and then return my completed text on paper, printed out using my typewriter. I think maybe many young people, maybe lots of you have probably never even touched a typewriter. And it was something we used every day. It's as if none of you had touched a computer, a home computer. Today, it's just pervasive, it's everywhere. But typewriters are can be found primarily in museums, I think. In my university, I would not know where to find a typewriter today. But it used to be the main tool that translators had to use. In addition, of course, to bilingual dictionaries, to glossaries in the library, the occasional professional, other people who worked on in a particular area, or translated documents similar to the ones we were working on. But it was a very hands-on, very non-technical job back then. And so that impacted translation teaching, and I want to start with that. So the topic is sort of translator education, past, present, and of course, the missing word is future. So this week, I won't talk about the future except peripherally, just a wee bit to give you an idea of where my most recent research is going. But it takes a big step beyond what I was writing about in the year 2000, when the book that Norman referred to was published. So over the past 20 years, I think I have published another 25 to 30 chapters and articles and 5 or 6 books on the emergent approach to translation teaching. So what we'll focus on today was everything that I experienced and studied and learned that led me to the present without going too far into the present. Okay, so I think it's important to have a foundation in understanding anyone's academic work, to look at where they came from, not only what they're writing today or what they've been writing this year, but what did they do at the beginning? How did they get started? And maybe this will give you an indication, those of you who are starting your master's degree now, where you will be in a year and a half, 2 years, or 3 years, whenever you write your master's thesis. How do you go about getting started writing a piece of research, doing a piece of research that might turn into more, that might turn into a PhD program somewhere in the world, like Norman has done. He's just completed his 450-page dissertation in Germany, coming from Antioquia. So, and having completed your program of studies. So it's great, I think, to think a little bit in advance about where you might be a few years from now and what you're going to do, and not just start thinking about it 2 or 3 weeks before you get there, which some of our students unfortunately do. It's great if they think about it a little bit earlier. And so that's one of my primary reasons for talking to you about this, is to help give you some ideas about how research can progress and has progressed for me, since I'm one of the grandfathers of a number of strands of study and research in translation teaching specifically, not other aspects of translation studies, but translation teaching. So I hope that will serve you in one sense or another. I don't know if any of you recognize the picture to the right of these words, translator education, past, present, and, but this is a human tower that of the type that is created or was created in the 1800s in Catalonia in Spain. And this has become a tradition for the past 130 years, approximately 140 years, where communities, villages, towns, and universities and schools and clubs create these teams of people who climb on each other's shoulders to create human towers. And they compete to be the first team to create this human tower and to raise a small child on their shoulders. And you can see 2 people climbing to the top. Normally there's 1. But there could be 2. On the right-hand side, you see what looks like, well, a young person climbing to the top of this tower. And she has to stand up on the top, the very top row of people, and that could be 5 or 6 layers of people, and raise her hand in the air. And that is the moment when the tower is complete. So this is a magnificent image that I came across in Tarragona when I was visiting and teaching there in the 1980s or 90s, actually, 1990s. And I came across a statue that represented one of these towers. And I thought, this is the image of what I want to do in the classroom. This is the image of what I want to do in the classroom. So I'd like you to keep this image in mind as we go along. And if you're interested, I can show you an excerpt from a film next week that shows people actually building the tower and then I would tell you a little bit more about it. But the basic underlying concept that is most important is collaboration. Imagine doing something like this without being able to collaborate. So I was not too, I mean, I was basically interested in collaboration in a very general sense in the 1980s when I started doing when I did my master's degree, which was a replacement document. Actually, I wrote a thesis on Translator Education, but it was external to the program. I studied the teaching of French for one of my master's degrees, and then I went back later to do a PhD, and I had to write my master's thesis after the fact. And I wrote it on what translator education was like in the 1980s, not only in Germany, but around the world. So there are lots of examples in that work, and those examples are listed and discussed in Pathways to Translation, which is the book that I published in 1995 and was based on my dissertation, which I finished in 1990. So this is a little walk down memory lane for me. I hope it will be an eye-opener for some of you, and maybe for some of you who are translation teachers or professional translators, certainly not as old as me, but still who've been around for a while, maybe this will take you down memory lane as well. So my question for myself was, where were we as translators, translators in training, translator trainers, and translator educators? I like to make a distinction between trainers and educators, which we'll get back to. And where were we 35 years ago in 1985, at least in Germany? So I'd like to take a quick look at some of the tools that I was using in the 1980s when I started to translate. This, on the lower left-hand side, is actually the typewriter that I used early in my work as a translator. This was a wonderful typewriter. It cost a fair amount of money at the time, but you didn't just type with it. You had a little screen here. I don't know if you can see this, my mouse on this, but right here, there's a little screen where a certain number of characters, I think about 20 characters, would appear. Oh, it says 30. 30 characters would appear as you type them. And if you made a mistake in those 30 characters, you could go back, erase any of those characters you wanted to, and retype them. So this made it possible to finish an entire page of work without any errors. Because with earlier typewriters, if you made a mistake, you had to start over all over again and type the entire page. And if you had a 20-page translation, that could take a long, long time to write. There were no computers at the time. That is, there were no home computers that we had available to us in any event. There were none at the university, except for one in the president's office. There was one computer that I saw at our university in 1984 when I began working, and that was in the office of the president. And the reason that I got to see it and work on it, with no experience using computers, of course, was that the president had a text that he needed to be translated into English for some visiting scholars. And so he needed someone to go to another city 100 kilometers away and type this translation into his computer in his office. Can you imagine that today? The whole university had no other computers except for the one owned by the president and housed in his office. So that was wild. That was just 1984, so 35 years ago. Then eventually, later in 1984, I got my first computer. And I suppose this computer also made it to Colombia as well, and Latin America, and perhaps all over the world. But it was an anachronism, or today, a child would laugh at it and say, no, I don't want that thing. I want a computer, Mom. So this computer had a keyboard. It had no screen. So you simply plugged it into the back of a TV set. And On this box here contained two little discs. Each one had a tape in it, like a little cassette tape, and each little tiny things. One of them contained a word processing program, and the other one was where you put the files that you were working on. And it was so antiquated. So, I mean, by modern standards, even the simplest, cheapest computer you can buy today is 1,000 times better, more performant than that Sinclair was in 1984. Along with that, so these are the tapes on the right-hand side. You can see the tapes that we used. It was just like a little cassette tape, one for the software program and one for your files that you were writing or reading. In order to transmit files back then, we had to use a telephone and a modem. So a modem is a device for sending digital data that is rarely used today. I haven't seen one in many, many years. And this is my phone at home and the modem that I used. To send a 3-page file took somewhere about 20 minutes, a 3-page file of just text, somewhere around 20 minutes to send it. And I often had to try again and again and again to make it work. It was really like the Stone Age, just 35 years ago. So what was translator education like before 1984 when I arrived there with no knowledge of translation, no knowledge of translator teaching? I had been trained as a language teacher in France, where I learned how to teach English through adult education courses. I didn't really have formal training rather in language teaching either, but I had no training at all in translation. But I became interested in it because a job opened up at the University of Mainz in 1985. I knew that that job would be available for an English speaker. And the university is located in a tiny town by the name of Germersheim. Looks like a Germersheim. If you wanted to look it up, it's the University of Mainz in Germersheim. And it's only the Department of Language Study and has had between 1,500 and 2,500 students every year since I started working there. So I had the opportunity of working there, and I thought the best thing for me to do is learn how to translate and learn how to teach translation properly. So I went into one classroom after another of colleagues who were willing to have me visit, and I watched them teach translation. And what they did in every case was the students were sitting in rows in the classroom. When the teacher walked in, the teacher came in with a pile of papers. Each one had the same text on it, a 1-page text, normally taken out of a newspaper, and he or she distributed them to the students. And on the first day, when the students had not had time to prepare in advance, he had the students read the part of the text and then translate part of the text for a few minutes, maybe 15 minutes, and then the text was reviewed in front of the class. So the teacher would go to the first student and say, so who will take the next sentence? And someone either volunteered or the teacher would choose someone, and that poor student, whoever it was, had to read aloud his or her text from the page. And the teacher would correct that sentence and say, okay, can anyone make suggestions on how to improve this? And I don't know whether this is done anywhere in the world anymore. I'm not sure. I gather that it is, but I don't know, because teachers tend to keep these things secret, what exactly goes on in their classrooms, at least in my part of the world. But what students had to do was be trained in transcoding a text from one language to produce an equivalent text in another language. So the theory was of teaching and the theory of translation was rather undeveloped at the time. There were a few theories like NIDA, for example, and Newmark, whose names you might know, Newmark from Great Britain and NIDA from the United States, who was involved in Bible translation. And there are a few more, Jean Delisle from Ottawa, Canada, who has visited you in the past couple of months, actually. And he was teaching already and had developed an approach to translation teaching in the 1980s. But the idea was transcoding. So taking the information encoded in an original text and moving to a target language and recreating a text on the basis of the code. So it was a linguistic process. In 1984, translation was largely linguistic, even though NIDA, who was involved in Bible translation, for example, and a few other scholars tried to bend that very rigid hold that, that linguistics had on translation to make it more human, make it less technical, less rigid, and less formal. So before 1984, students got trained in doing this. They had to transcode one text after another. And they had to be educated. So I went from training to education. So training is when you learn how to drive a truck, you learn how to drive a tractor, you learn how to operate a machine. And so they're very specific, simple things that you do to the machine to make it do what it's supposed to do. Education goes a big step beyond that, I think, to making you into, helping you become a whole person, an educated person, a person with a sense of ethics, a sense of history, an understanding of various fields that are related to what you're doing. For example, for translators, linguistics, cultural studies, and translation theory, and you could go on to others as well. So training on the one hand was important, and education on the other hand was also important. But our students, when I got to Gammersheim in 1984, took courses either in training or in some other area of learning, but they were not mixed together. So in translation practice classes, you didn't learn theory that you then applied. You simply applied techniques, strategies handed to you by the teacher to particular problems in a text. What I noticed that even back then in 1984, when I arrived and I was studying the system so that I could enter into it and participate in it, was that classes were identical in the first semester right through the end of the program. And this was a 5-year program. You could go into a class in first semester translation and 15th semester, well, 7th semester rather, translation, or 8th, often students spent as many as 9 or 10. And what was going on was exactly the same. The teacher was feeding knowledge to students. I had already been trained or learned how to be an English teacher based on a totally different model of learning. And I can't go into it here because it's just too time consuming. That would be a topic for another day. And Norman and I have written a book in Spanish on the method that we've developed on the basis of this alternative approach. And I've written another book in Italian together with another student, and another one in English with a colleague of mine. So that there would be 2 points of view in each book, all on this different approach. But basically, the underlying idea is that learning is not necessarily or not best learned through rote memorization, the study of grammar and the application of rules, but it's learned through communication per se. And you all know of methods where communication is the heart of the process of learning. But I've developed an approach that tries to push that to a new level. But that would be a topic of another talk. So if you'd like to hear about it, invite me back and I'll be glad to come and talk about it. When I started studying translation, I was required to earn a PhD. So my boss, when she gave me my job in 1985, she said, oh, you have a contract, but you have exactly 3 years from today to complete your PhD. And the best thing to do would be to do it in translation studies. My problem was that I didn't know any German. Well, I knew a tiny, tiny bit of German, but there's no way that I could read difficult books involving theory in various fields and translation studies and to write a 300 or 400 page book in German. There's no way I could do it. So I went back to the United States, where I'm from, and I did my PhD there in English, which was a godsend, as you can imagine. Norman is very brave in that he's gone to Germany to do his dissertation, but fortunately he was able to write it in Spanish. And everyone insisted on him being able to do that so that he could do his very best work. I wanted to do my very best work as well, so I went back to the United States to do my dissertation. One of the first books that I came across in studying translation studies, even though the courses basically had nothing to do with translation studies, they were about applied linguistics, but I twisted each course that I took to fit into my area of interest, which was translation teaching. So I started studying things like John Catford's linguistic, the book is called A Linguistic Theory of Translation, published in 1960 in Chicago, Illinois, and it was a very influential book, believe it or not. From today's perspective, I can imagine that most of you will shake your heads when you hear what this theory entails, but it was the norm. In the 1960s, 1970s, and early 1980s, this was the way that translation was viewed by many, many people, including instructors where I taught. The idea is that translation is a transcoding process, involving words, phrases, clauses, or sentences, and the translator is supposed to choose formal or functional. I won't go into that, but you can read about it on your own if you want. Elements from the original text, like words, phrases, clauses, or sentences, and transcode them in a parallel fashion into the target text. So take a word, put in the target text. If it's better to choose a phrase and you decide if it is or not, you choose a phrase and you translate that, you transcode it into the words in the target language, and you plug it in, and you move on to the sentence. You make sure your whole sentence is okay, and then you end up with translation. Voila. So I found that quite interesting, and I said, okay, this is my starting point. Where can we go from here? And then I started doing research on where this idea came from. Did it make any sense? And then it turned out that that was a starting point for my entire career, which has involved the publication of 7 books, I believe, and 60 articles and chapters of books and years of research and teaching at a university, all based on the epiphanies that I had as a young man of starting to do research in translation studies when I knew nothing about translation. This is a quote from John Firth. John Firth is a very famous linguist that you probably have never heard of. He died some time ago, and he wrote a lovely book called Linguistics in Translation, published in 1956. He didn't talk that much about translation in his work, but he was a linguist and the head of the linguistics department at the University of London. And I found it amazing when I read this quote from Firth, because Catford, remember this, the picture from before? Let's see if I can go back. This picture was done by a gentleman by the name of John Catford in 1960. Well, not this one. He actually wrote the book, Linguistic Theory of Translation, 1960. I created this image to depict his theory in 1990. And this is what Firth wrote in 1956. And this is a statement that Catford claims his theory is built on, his theory of transcoding. I'd like to give it to you because it's, even though it's long, because I think it's so telling about different ways that one can look at translation. So he wrote, I want to make it clear that the linguistic systems and structures are related to the systems and structures in the relevant events, relevant objects and people and what they are doing. You have the option. So as a translator, you have two ways of going. You have the option of connecting structures and systems of language with structures and systems of thought, or with structures and systems in situations comprising the human participants, their nonverbal behavior, their relevant objects, and other events and their alternatives. Most important part, I suggest, difficult though it may appear, that the situational matrix is the more manageable one and more easily related to problems of translation. Situational matrix means looking at the situation in which language is used, looking at language use not as a coding process, a transcoding, a decoding, a recoding process, but as a communicative process where certain objects are in the world around you or in the situation that the text is about. And there's nonverbal behavior, there are gestures that are made, there are facial expressions. People walk in certain ways, they use space in different ways when they express themselves. And there are nonverbal and non-personal events. There are cars that drive through and you don't see the driver, whatever. There are all kinds of things in the situation that have to be observed and interpreted. And then a new text is created in culture B, language B. So let's say we're going from German, culture A, to Spanish, culture B. Of course, there are many subcultures, but you see what I mean. It's some subculture or some culture that you're translating into, but you're not transcoding. This is the most important thing that Firth wrote about translation, I think, in 1956. I found it astounding to realize this when I was starting my PhD work. I continued that work and finished in 1999 and that work involved the use of think aloud protocols. So I got a group of students and a group of graduate translators to sit alone in a room with a text, and they had a limited amount of time and a tape recorder, and they had to type the translation of a text, short text, a half a page, into English, from German into English. And then I took note of, and then I had them talk at the same time. They had to say what was going on in their minds while translating. And so I coded everything that I heard. For example, this is Andrea, who is a novice translator. I hope these things aren't in your way. Okay, I'll move it. So Andrea, so she started at the first element and went through the end. Some of the elements are marked with a letter, like A, B, C, and so on. The others are marked with a number. The ones marked with a letter, I found to be spontaneous translation. So you read the word pan and you think bread. You don't have to go searching for it in a dictionary. You don't even have to search for it in your mind. It's on the tip of your tongue waiting to be produced. And then there are other things where you have a special kind of something or other, some aspect of the culture that's being mentioned, or a word that you simply don't know, and you have to look it up in a bilingual dictionary, like here, or you simply come up with 2 or 3 opportunities, like here, or options, and you have to choose one of them based on your thinking processes, or you have to ask someone else, which was not really allowed, or you had to go to a monolingual dictionary. And so I recorded in this very simplified graphic manner what people were doing while translating. And this was one of the very first projects involving think aloud protocols in translation studies. I think there had been something like 4 of them started or done before I began mine. And I came up with a completely different approach to doing my research and recording the data that I found. So this wasn't borrowed from anyone else at all. What I found, though, was quite interesting, because I found that novices often in my context, often had far more complex structures. That is, more complex problem-solving structures involving strategies than professionals. So here I have someone I called a professional, Arnold, and he used his intuitive knowledge very often. So he saw a word or an expression, sentence in German, and he simply wrote something down without thinking, without searching, without opening a book. And Andrea, who was a beginner, had very complex structures. So she thought, oh, I don't know how to say that. What am I going to do? Shall I reduce the meaning? Shall I paraphrase? Shall I throw this word out and start over again? All kinds of strategies. So I look in a bilingual dictionary like LL is for bilingual dictionary. Shall I rephrase like ABC to CBA? Shall I switch it around in German and then say that in English? So they came up with these strategies. So that's what I was after. I gave up on this research very quickly. I finished my dissertation in 1990 and came up with this model, which at the time was considered to be very representative and plausible in the field of translation studies and in the field of cognitive science. This is in the good old days. Things have changed. Because back then, I looked at things like the processing centers. I hypothesized a relatively uncontrolled processing center and a relatively controlled one. And I suggested that when you use intuitions to solve your problems, you read one word and you just say something in the other language without thinking about it, without looking for it, without looking it up, then you're using the relatively uncontrolled processing center. And the relatively controlled one is where you use strategies, use particular plans to try to resolve your problems. And you produce translation problems, you find them by, oh, you read it and you say, oh, I don't know how to say that. Or I've seen that word somewhere. Maybe it's in the bilingual dictionary. So problems come out of your thinking, both controlled and uncontrolled, but mostly controlled. And then you come up with tentative translation elements, which you plug into the target text. So this model was borrowed by people like Hans Hoenig, who changed the shape of it and so on, but he basically used this model in his book that came out in 1995, book on think aloud processes and translator education. But I took a look at it myself. When I finished my dissertation, I looked back and said, where have I come? Where am I now in my thinking? And I thought, it struck me, if you look at the shape of this that we have in the middle, it's supposed to represent a head, and it's supposed to be a closed-in structure. It's the shape of an egg. And all the processes are going on inside of that. And it's very much dependent on a brain, the mind is inside the head belief. And that belief has changed over the years. And now there's what we call second generation cognitive science, dating back at least to 1990, that suggests that a lot of what the mind is outside of the brain. A lot of it is in communication. It's in books that we use. It's in tools that we use. We store translations. We store notes. We write them on a page, or write something out and then try to rewrite it and then use that in our translation. But a lot of thinking, it can be understood this way, that a lot of thinking goes on outside of an individual head. And so I had to restart my whole approach to translation teaching and look back at a translation not only as a coding process and not primarily as one, but as a social process, So here I was focused in my dissertation on the cognitive process. All of this is going on in the head. And the model I came up with in my 2000 book, which was 10 years later, suggests that learning is a matter of interacting with others. It involves things like self-reliance, experience, and expertise. And these are things that a student needs to develop. And on the left-hand side, we see concepts of autonomy, authenticity, and competence. So these are things that you need to develop, I've said to myself, and I wrote in articles and books back in the beginning of the century, 20 years ago. And I suggested then that uninitiated individuals could learn at the lowest level, and then they should start working in pairs and then in collaborative groups. And that the beginnings of translation studies might involve consciousness raising about the problems involved in translation, and eventually move on to scaffolded reflective action. Scaffolded simply means that someone provides assistance and a basic structure, a supportive structure to the learner. And then on the competence level, you can start out as a novice, you don't know anything about translation, and then you become an apprentice to an instructor and do your work under his or her supervision, and eventually become a journeyman, which in common parlance in areas of crafts, for example, and the development of craftsmanship is a journeyman, the person who can do a day's work. And then you move on from there to be a professional translator, where you are self-reliant, that is, capable of doing your own work, you have some experience, and you have expertise. So this was a very early model of my much more recent work, which goes off in a slightly different direction, but the bases are the same. And I wanted to show you the basis of it, dating back now to the year 2000. I was quite, as the British say, I was quite chuffed, quite happy with this when I produced it. When I look at it now, I think of it as being very outdated. My first model of translator competence, and as you know, there have been lots of models of translator competence created over the past 20 years approximately. The first one suggested there's a social competence, a personal competence, and translation competence. So that there's the individual side, personal competence, including autonomy, preparedness for lifelong learning, quality control, professional responsibility. And then the social aspect includes etiquette, negotiation, teamwork. These are things that I found already in 2006, 14 years ago, were essential to the translator's work. And the translator's profession has evolved in that time enormously. So when you go out to work as translators, you won't, a translator who studied in 2006 will barely recognize the world that you face out there. Translator competence, translation competence, includes a lot of what we've been teaching students for decades: linguistic knowledge, cultural knowledge, text typology, newspaper text as opposed to scientific texts or academic reports, norms and conventions, what texts are supposed to look like, terminology work, knowledge of the world, how does the world work, strategies, technology, and research. This is translation competence per se. Translator competence includes all three things. So linguistic, that knowledge of transcoding, is one little piece of this great big picture today. And this was the beginning of my most recent work in translation teaching. And I'll give you lots of examples, concrete examples next week of how this is implemented in what I do today. I won't go on, spend much time on this, but you might compare this to your own curriculum and consider to what extent it's similar or different. I found this to be very constraining. This is a modularized post-Bologna curriculum. Bologna, of course, is a Bologna Agreement on education, which standardized and unified education across Europe. And there were certain requirements and suggestions that were proposed, and one of them involved modularization, which meant you, instead of having a set of 25 courses, for example, to complete your degree, you had to do 7 or 8 sets of 3. So you see there's one that's read here, one that's read here, one that's read here, and you could simply choose three courses and complete a module. And you could do them over the course of your program of studies, either a 3-year BA program or a 2-year MA program. but it's very much like a menu where you just say, oh, I think I'll take this as as my salad, and then I'll have some soup, and then I'll have the main dish, and then I'll have dessert, and you simply have a list of things. In our system, there's no possibility of having any kind of progression included because you don't know when students are going to take the different courses. So you can't go from 1 to 2 to 3 within the course structure because you don't know if your students will be taking the course at that time or not. And when they start, they might find this course to be of interest, and they're only in their first semester. So this is one of the big problems back then. There was lots of personal choice built into the curriculum, but the modularization system, I think, left something to be desired. So that's another thing I started working on. Now, our time is almost up. We're almost at 4 o'clock. And I just wanted to give you a taste of all these things. And I want to give you a taste right now of what led me away from these what I see as very mundane structures and images and conceptions and conceptualizations to something that I find to be much more beautiful on the one hand, but also on the other hand, much, much more human and much more effective than the conventional geometrical approach that I was taking before. So does this look like a bird to you, or am I wrong? Is this not basically in the shape of a bird? But this is not a painting. This is what you call a murmuration of starlings. And that's something I'm going to have to find out what it's called in Spanish, because I don't know. And it's the structure, the type of structure that is created by a large group of thousands of starlings, birds, when they're being attacked by another bird. And you can see the other bird, I think it's here. No, like you can't see it in this picture. Normally you can see the attacking bird, and it's somewhere out here coming in saying, oh, lunch. I'm going to eat some of these birds. And then they come in from a distance and they say, God, that is a huge bird. There's no way I can eat that bird. And starlings unwittingly seem to create these structures to protect themselves as a group of starlings. Is that incredible or not? This is Mother Nature. And what I've found is that Mother Nature does many, many things using similar structures that are dynamic, that evolve, that emerge from an impetus, and that look very similar. So there's certain features of this that I have tried to apply to translator education. You might think that is a tough, we say, a tough row to hoe, a very difficult road to travel. How do you go from pictures like this to teaching better in the classroom? I'll explain it next week. But this is another aspect of this fractal geometry, fractales. You might look them up between now and next week. Find out what un fractal is in Spanish. Voy a coger la oportunidad de hablar en español la semana que viene. Entonces, sería válido y útil seguramente de hacer un poco de investigación, lectura en inglés, pero en español vale también para la semana que viene. So this is another representative of the fractal organization of nature. And this can be found at every level of nature and every type of science, from the subatomic to the extraterrestrial and the universe. In different structures, you find the same kind of thing. This is 2.5 million square kilometers in size, 2.5 million. And it was created simply by water falling on a landscape. This is raindrops that fell on a landscape and formed a river, and the river formed itself. The river formed itself. And that's the most important message that I've gleaned myself for my approach to teaching translation. I've moved beyond the teaching to the learning. And here's another one, same kind of thing, a fractal landscape in Australia. And you see this bifurcating structure. So where you have a big branch or a trunk of a tree that branches off, and each branch branches off again and again and again. And there's similarity between the smaller ones and the larger ones. And it creates itself. There is no impetus that makes this structure appear. It simply emerges. This is a microscopic snapshot from our fractal universe. And these is certain kind of cell, Purkinje cells that can be found in a brain. These happen to be in a rat's brain. But what's missing is the linear structure that one normally finds in curricula. First, you open this box, and then you learn the stuff in that box. Then you walk down the hall next semester, and you take the next course. And then you walk to the next one. And here you've got to learn study these 5 pages. Next week, you do another 5 pages. Next week, you do the next. Everything is linear in education. I've written entire articles about linearity in education, not only in translator education, but in education in general, over the past 15 years. I find it a fascinating topic, and I'm convinced that this is one of the biggest problems with education around the world, is its linear structure. Because the world isn't linear. You don't find anything geometrical in accordance with Euclidean geometry in the universe. Only things that are man-made. You find square things, perfectly round things, almost perfectly round, in the world that man has made, in things that we structure, in buildings, in windows, in doors, all kinds of things. But in the natural world, you find bends and curves and bifurcating structures. And in our brains, you find bifurcating structures, and you find no straight lines at all. So that's it. I want to stop there because that's about the first half. And this gives you, I hope, a good rough idea of how I got started. There's only so much one can cover in 1 hour when you're talking about 35 years of work. But I hope it's been a little bit interesting to you. And I hope to see you again next week when we move on from there. But perhaps you have some questions. And I think the questions are being collected now, the ones that have been made through the chat. And maybe I can address some of them right away. Okay, I'll turn things back over to you. Stop sharing. Okay, I'm back.
Profesor Kirali, me quedo sin palabras para agradecerle por esta bella y enriquecedora presentación. Yo creo que todos los asistentes aquí en la sala de Zoom y las personas que nos están siguiendo desde España, desde Canadá, seguramente también han disfrutado mucho de esta presentación. Le agradecemos de verdad de todo corazón y pues quiero dar la palabra a los estudiantes de la maestría o a los profesores que nos acompañan para que le hagan preguntas al respecto de su presentación.
Gracias, muchas gracias. Espero que haya algunas preguntas. A ver, ¿en inglés o en alemán?
O en español.
o español o francés, como queráis. Juan Guillermo Ramírez Giraldo, veo no sé quién. Ok, va a hablar, ok.
Hi,
bueno,
everyone.
Hola.
Hi, Professor Giraldo.
Hello.
Thanks a lot for your talk. It was very, very interesting, and I think we can learn a lot from it, even from the earliest pages in your path. I think there's a lot to learn still.
Good.
In our context. At least I think it's important not to discard what we've learned from the past. And I think in our context, there's still a lot to do in those fronts, because even like from a cognitive perspective, there's not a lot that we have found out from our context that I think it would be interesting to do. I'm guessing Norman will have a lot to say in that respect. In one of the questions, of the many questions that emerged, if I can steal the verb from your
sure.
is there seems to be a tension between, I would say, institutional drive to standardization, you know?
Yes, yes.
More evidently so in the European context, but increasingly so here in Latin America even. And with this idea of an emergence of the translation or translator competence, could you elaborate more on how I don't know if this will be a matter of your next presentation, but I'm just curious, how do you know when you're done in an academic context? You know what I mean? Like, this is what you should achieve in an academic context, independently from how each translator develops her or how her competence emerges.
Yes.
Right? How do we reconcile the need in an academic context for standards and learning goals and learning objectives with this? I'm not going to say individual, because of course you've shown that it is not individual, but it takes place at a very idiosyncratic, I guess, because it depends on so many conditions at a very idiosyncratic pace, I would say.
It's a lovely question. It's something that I have been dealing with for a long time, and I have to sort of run away from it, because I'm in the lucky environment, a very lucky environment, in that we have a lot of freedom in German universities to do what we want in the classroom, even if we're doing something quite innovative and unusual with respect to what everyone else is doing. And I have noticed in other countries around Europe and in the United States that normally there are things like learning goals and objectives provided to teachers and university instructors that they are supposed to follow. And essentially imposing a lockstep kind of structure on learning. So by the end of the first semester or the end of the first year, everyone is supposed to have learned these particular strategies or have covered this particular set of the canon of readings from the canon. And then you move on to the next stage and the next stage and the next stage. I have written a lot about this, and I can't really go on into it here, but it all dates back to the Enlightenment and the development of the idea of method in the 16th century, where curricula started to be developed on the basis of this very linear structure. You must learn this little bit first, and then the next bit, and the next bit, and everyone should learn at the same pace. This all started in the 1600s or 16th century and has continued right up to the present day. If you look at elementary schools, high schools, you see the same kind of thing going on at every level of education. As one scholar wrote, Bruffy is his name, William Bruffy. You see it from the kindergarten level to graduate studies around the world. This idea of structuring and spoon feeding the knowledge that you're supposed to have. But there's an alternative way of looking at learning that goes beyond the constructivist and beyond the behaviorist, and that is emergentist specifically, and that is not to expect everyone to attain the same level at the same moment. Imagine if you had two children and they grew up exactly the same, 2 years apart, and one of them is interested in math and the other was great at playing the violin. Would you say, well, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you good at math? You're supposed to be mastering math. That's what's on the curriculum today. We don't do that with our own children. But in schools, there's an insistence around the world on imposing structure and identical marching from one stop to the next that are predefined by teachers. And I think this is something that desperately needs work. And there's so much room at universities because often you have, at least in our environment in Germany, we are given freedom to innovate and to then share with others how we are dealing with problems. And we're not told, you must do it this way. That can be a problem, of course, if you're at a university that doesn't provide that freedom, and what you have to do is get that freedom. We didn't have it here 7 or 8 years ago. We were forced to meet in class every week for 90 minutes, for example. And we were warned, the teachers and professors were warned, that someone could come and observe us and make sure that we were in class at the right time. Now we can have classes that are completely online or partially online, and nobody comes and checks us anymore. But that required the interference of teachers who were thinking in terms of effective education and who insisted the university had to change. We can't accept our institutions as if they were structured the way they will remain forever. We have to be agents in improving them and changing them, modifying them over time.
And if I may counter ask, in this context that you've described, where you have more freedom and what you've called an emergentist approach, how do you know when you're done? Is it done in terms? I mean, in terms of a university program? How do you know when you're done? Is it a matter of time? What you learn to do, or what emerges in these 4 or 5 years? That's it, and then you're a translator. How does that work?
Yes, as I will get to next week and show graphically, we don't think of, at least I don't think of the learner as of the student as beginning his studies when he or she enters university. They have been learning from before they were born. They started, each of us started learning his or her mother tongue before we were born. And we learned a lot about the world. We learned a lot about communicating in our mother tongue, at least when we were small children. And that is all, as the French say, an acquis, right? It's something you've got that you can hold on to. So when we come to the university, we have a lot of, also the French word is bagage, right? The luggage that you carry around with you, your personal past. So it's never a matter of getting done, is my point. Like you're never done. The school and then university has that, imposes a requirement to do certain things. But instead of saying you must have read the canon, you have to take this particular exam in that particular subfield and in that other one, and you must pass with a grade of 85% or more. Instead of doing that, you can say students must do a series of authentic projects and hand them in to be evaluated by professionals or by their teachers who also function as professional translators. It's so easy to do. But the hard part is convincing powers that be to let us try. And if it works, then they are readily convinced. That's been my experience over the years. And I've been fighting the system for 35 years. And now I don't have to fight very much anymore, because if you've got evidence, then people will let you do what you want to do. I don't worry about where my students are at the end of their studies, because each one is a complete individual, right? If there's any organ that you would not want to have replaced by somebody else's organ, that is your brain, isn't it? And it's because it's structured by your personal experience, and they are never the same. And I think that is essential for us as teachers to remember every time we walk into a classroom or deal with students online. Each one of them is an absolute individual, and we should never expect them to complete the same thing at the same time. That changes the structure and nature of education, of course, but I've found all sorts of ways of dealing with the simplistic aspect of giving grades and meeting requirements. My students always do that. And I'll give you lots of concrete examples with the work that they have done next week.
Muchas gracias, profesor, por la respuesta. Tenemos también una pregunta de Carlos Franco, estudiante de la maestría. Carlos, puedes abrir el micrófono y hacer tu pregunta.
Muchas gracias, Alejandro. Well, first of all, I would like to thank John Curley for the space and all the knowledge that you share with us today.
You're welcome.
And it's for us, I think it is quite important as a master degree student in translation, especially, to learn all of this, to know where all start and where are we going to be in the next 5, 10, or 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to say, if I may, to make the questions to ask you, but in French. Can I do it?
Pas de problème.
D'accord. Donc, ma question serait la suivante. En fait, dans votre opinion personnelle, quelle serait la place ou le statut du traducteur, et non seulement en 2021, mais si on les pense en 2030, 2031, d'ici 10 ans, quelle serait la place, quel serait le statut du traducteur, de la traduction au niveau mondial? Qu'est-ce qui va se passer avec les traducteurs?
Si je savais cela, je serais riche aujourd'hui. Parce que
Bien sûr.
comment est-ce qu'on pourrait savoir ce qui va se passer dans 10 ans? Surtout si je pense à 35 ans en arrière, les changements qui ont survenu dans ce temps et dans ma propre vie comme traducteur, un an après l'autre, c'était énorme. Et je ne peux absolument pas imaginer comment ça va être dans 10 ans. Donc, je pense que qu'on devrait faire, c'est de préparer les étudiants pour l'avenir et il est égal ce qui va se survenir. Il faut être préparé pour ce qui se passe. Et pour moi, la partie plus importante, c'est la partie humaine. Et ça, on va voir la semaine prochaine aussi, parce que la partie technique, on ne peut pas savoir, on ne peut pas prévoir les changements qu'on va voir dans notre vie dans les 10 ans à venir. Mais les personnes humaines ne vont pas tellement changer. Elles n'ont pas changé beaucoup dans 100 000 ans. On est presque les mêmes qu'il y a très longtemps. Et c'est cette partie qui souffre, je crois, dans l'enseignement supérieur maintenant, un peu partout, à cause de la technique, la technologie. Elle est importante aussi, mais elle change sans cesse. Donc, il faut être préparé pour apprendre à utiliser les nouvelles technologies au fur et à mesure. Lorsqu'elles se présentent, il faut s'y adapter. Et on est en train de le faire maintenant, tous, surtout les enseignants, avec les cours à distance. Je le vois dans ma femme, par exemple, qui est enseignante à une école tout près d'ici. Elle n'avait jamais utilisé l'ordinateur pour communiquer avec les étudiants. Mais il y a une dizaine de mois, elle y était obligée par les circonstances, par cette maladie horrible. Et maintenant, elle sait utiliser une quantité incroyable, avec une complexité incroyable d'outils technologiques. Et je pense que cela est venu tout seul, parce qu'elle était obligée, elle avait des connaissances de base qui lui ont permis de continuer à apprendre. Et c'est ça dont nos étudiants ont besoin aussi, la possibilité de continuer à apprendre pendant toute leur vie et une certaine autonomie vis-à-vis les technologies et vis-à-vis nous-mêmes. Ils ne peuvent pas être obligés de nous avoir à leur côté lorsqu'ils auront terminé leurs études.
Ben oui, c'est précisément ça. Donc, je vous remercie énormément parce que c'est précisément moi aussi. Donc, j'ai eu l'opportunité, je continue à avoir l'opportunité d'enseigner à distance dans une université publique en Colombie. Donc, c'est un peu le défi. Donc, de trouver les manières, le moyen, la technologie, même du côté de l'expérience, la théorie, la pratique et tout ce qui fait partie. Donc, c'est quelque chose qui va nous enrichir énormément dans la pratique. Donc, de nouveau, merci beaucoup, donc Yarli, parce que c'était vraiment formidable.
Merci beaucoup et merci pour la question.
A vous.
Profesor, tenemos algunas preguntas que nos hacen en el chat de YouTube. La primera la hace Marcela y dice, is there any recommendation to start translation? How would be a good strategy?
I'm not sure what's meant by to start translation.
I had the same doubt.
I don't quite understand what's meant.
Okay, so let's. I'm going to ask another question, and let's ask Marcela. Marcela, you're listening, so if you can refine your question, please. Another question was from Alba Lopez. When was the first time you taught in a translation per se bachelor or master degree? When did universities start teaching translation studies?
Oh, that's interesting because I work at one of the very first institutions to offer classes or degrees in translation studies in the world. And that was at the University of Mainz in 1948 is when we started teaching translation. And what's interesting is between 1948 and 1984, there was virtually no change in teaching processes or teaching procedures or teaching strategies. It stayed very much the same, and teaching was simply borrowed from other fields at that point, linguistics and language teaching, but there was no teaching that was really designed to be suitable for translation students per se.
Okay, thank you. And Professor Kirali, tenemos en este momento a Álvaro Echeverry desde Montreal, acaba de unirse a nuestra reunión. Entonces, Álvaro, welcome, bienvenue. Es un placer tenerte aquí entre nosotros. Antes de que Álvaro haga su pregunta, yo quiero contarle a los estudiantes de la tercera cohorte de la maestría en traducción que Álvaro Echeverry es egresado de la Escuela de Idiomas de la Universidad de Antioquia. Pues hizo estudios de maestría en Estados Unidos y su doctorado lo hizo en la Universidad de Montreal. Y bueno, conoce muy bien al profesor Kirali también, y hemos tenido a Álvaro también en algunos eventos, incluso visitó Colombia para estar con nosotros en la maestría en traducción hace algunos años.
Tiene la chaqueta, tiene la camiseta.
Es un placer, es un placer estar aquí con Álvaro. Así que, Álvaro, sin más preámbulos, adelante, puedes intervenir.
Muchas gracias, Alejo. Hola a todos, felicitaciones por la tercera cohorte. Don, it's very nice to see you again.
Nice to see you too, again.
And it's very nice to, you know, that I've been following your work not since 1994 or the 80s, but I really, I was just listening to you, and I was saying that's why I always go with your work, because I think that's an interesting way, though sometimes it's really hard to make it pass through institutions.
Yeah. Yes.
It was very nice. You know, when I listen or when I read about what you said about emergence, about autopoiesis and things like that, concepts that come from theories of learning, I think that's one of the points, and I have discussed with the colleagues in the University of Antioquia and with colleagues everywhere else. And the point is that when we teach translation, we start, as you said, from a very training perspective. And we don't take the time to go a little bit through education, and that education implies talking about theories of learning.
Yes.
Because teachers just do, many of the teachers in translation, they do what they know what to do to translate, but sometimes it's, how about learning? What do we know about people learning?
Great.
And I was listening to you and thinking about, with my students, I try to do something like that to give them a chance to go at their own rhythm and stuff like that. But they've been trained, let's say, trained to be fed, as you said. And we as teachers, we organize the world for them. But the thing is that once they go into the real world, they realize that the world is not organized. And that's why the fractal things, the fractal idea that you're bringing to your thought, to your proposition, to your theories, it's important in the sense that students also, they have to understand that the world is not organized. And that's one of the things about pedagogy and a structure, as you said, is that we try to put it in an artificial order that doesn't exist. And that's one of the points. So listening to you, it was just, how do we bring these ideas into practice? And that's one of the things. Right. And as you said, is context. In my context, I can also use it in the university, but most of my colleagues and some of the teachers, they don't have that chance.
Yeah.
So my question was, any idea, any proposition, how do we bring this thing into practice, the idea of not organizing the world for students?
This is exactly what I'll be presenting next week in some detail with specific projects that I've carried out. I say I carry them out, but I don't carry them out. I initiate them, and then the students carry them out. And it was what's really interesting for me is that it was not an easy process, even for me. And I was convinced from the beginning, I was my own best disciple, but I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know how to get away from old structures. I didn't know how to get the students out of their passive mode of sitting there waiting for me to feed them. And when they wouldn't respond by taking the reins of a project at the beginning, I would do it for them. And then they would say, okay, it's yours. And that was a huge mistake on my part, but maybe we have to go through mistakes in order to learn. And I fortunately been able to do the same project for 16 semesters and with new groups of students and new texts every time. But I've been able to observe my work, my behavior, and the students' reactions and everything. So what I've come up with at this point, after 16 semesters of doing the same thing, very different from the beginning, is give the responsibility to the students from the beginning, offer it to them. If they don't want to take it, we will end up doing a traditional class, but I never allow them to choose that. I mean, they think I'm giving them a choice, but it's like the devil in the deep blue sea. I say, I can just find a bunch of boring texts and you can sit there and translate them and I will bore you to tears if you want that. And they never choose that. They choose the project. And the project involves a real job that comes from the outside that is given to us as a real job to be done, and that has to be done by a certain time, a certain day, and a very high degree of quality. And it's done into the students' foreign language, into English, and they're all non-native speakers of English. This is a tough job. And so they gulp at the beginning and say, how are we going to do this? We've never done this before. And then they organize themselves. Autopoiesis is exactly the concept by providing real structure. So I say, it's a real project. It's not a fake project that I've created for you. What are we going to do? And they say, well, we don't know the terminology. Okay, how are we going to work on terminology? And they say, well, is there anything any way you can guide us a little bit? Sure. I said, sure. And so I give them things that I can give them as stepping stones, as first steps on the ladder, and they have to round that out and they go and do their own research and learn more about terminology than I know. I have to get them started. And that's what I do. I initiate them into the world of a real project as best I can, but I give them complete freedom to change the structure as they wish. And I observe them with Slack. I personally use Slack, which allows you to watch entire conversations. And I've noticed that we end up with somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 messages going back and forth between the students over the course of the semester. And I can go in and look and see when a problem arose, who brought up the problem? How was it responded to? Who resolved it? How long did it take them to resolve it? I don't necessarily have to do anything with that knowledge, but it gives me an understanding of their thought processes. And I've noticed that the longer I can stay out of it, the better, the more likely it is that they are going to resolve the problem themselves. And I've acquired incredible respect for our students and their maturity if I give them a sense that I believe in you, you can do this. They do it, they run with it. And very rarely does a person drop the ball. And I've been so happy with that, that I keep going in that same direction, providing more, a little less support and a little bit more initial structure and confidence that they can do it. And then they wind up doing it. And eventually, if I show that I care about them, they will even come and ask me questions, which at the beginning was very difficult because German students don't like to ask questions of anyone. They say, it's my job. I've got to do it by myself. And here it's a matter of interacting with others, talking to other students, asking the teacher, I'm stuck here. Can you help me a little bit? There's no crime in that. There's no need for them to know everything. But then I don't resolve everything for them. I give them a hint. I give them a helping hand to get started, and they resolve their own problems themselves. And very quickly, they all catch on to this idea. Aha, so that's a way to learn too. It doesn't have to be all spoon-fed. Yeah. So nice seeing you again.
Same here. Thank you very much.
I'll never forget that short trip I made to Montreal and and visiting the old town with you and your wife. We had a really lovely time, and I'll never forget it. I'll never forget it. Thanks again so much.
Yeah, see you next week.
Yes, okay.
Muchas gracias. Profesor, hay dos preguntas en el chat de YouTube. Voy a tratar de unirlas. La primera dice, how do you perceive the role of artificial intelligence in the translation world? Y la otra pregunta es, creo que están muy relacionadas, if what is said about the effect of modern communication and information technologies on the brain of new generation is true, have you seen any signs of this in how your students actually learn?
That last question didn't really have, it was missing some part. So I,
Dice, if what is said about the effect of modern communication and information.
I don't know what is said. I don't know what the person
Sí,
means.
dice algo así como, si lo que se dice sobre el efecto de las comunicaciones modernas y las tecnologías de la información, los efectos que tienen el cerebro de las nuevas generaciones es cierto, ¿usted ha visto algunos efectos o algunas señales de esto y cómo están aprendiendo sus estudiantes en la actualidad?
Okay, well, I think I understand because this person mentions los efectos que todo el mundo conoce y no los conozco yo. No sé lo que de qué está hablando, pero no importa porque he visto efectos de todos modos, sobre todo en cuanto a, switch back to Spanish, sorry, especially with respect to using digital devices to do things in a quick manner. Because this is a huge change from earlier thinking when we had to think something through. When you have a computer or a telephone that has a resource on it that you can where you can look something up and it's fed back to you instantly, you don't have to think through it. I think we can do without the verb think through. That is really to think deeply about something and create new new pathways in your brain. Neuronal pathways by thinking. So we just receive the information on the surface, we plug it in, and I find that students have started to reflect much less on what's fed to them. So they get something like a response to a question about a term, a translation, and they simply plug it in to their target text and hand it in. And don't think about, let me consider this critically. So critical thinking, I've noticed, is falling by the wayside to a great extent. Also care in translation and knowing how to translate. My students are not learning how to translate anymore. The students I get in my authentic projects, which I'll talk about next week, for the most part, do failing quality work at the beginning of every semester. Failing quality work every new semester when they join me, and they're doing a real project. And what's wrong is that when they're given translations to do in regular classes, they simply take their phone out, hold it under their desk, and plug the sentences into DeepL, and then use that as their translation. But they don't translate themselves. And if you don't translate yourself, you're not learning how to translate. And then you're not going to be able to correct a computer's translation or another person's translation. So for me, this is a very nefarious, negative effect on thinking that comes from the machine world that we increasingly live in. Artificial intelligence, I think, can be useful for education, for especially learning about mental processes, how do brains work, how do computers work, how do we make them more efficient? But what they don't do is help us be more human or hold on to those human qualities that are essential to people working in social sciences. If translation is no longer a social science and simply a transcoding process, then we don't need translators anymore. And that is a possibility. But I'm not sure whether we need artists either. Have you ever thought of having a machine that can create artwork? Would that mean that artists don't need to go and find another job? That we don't need artists anymore because a computer can create something that looks like artwork? And I wonder if we don't need translators anymore, perhaps there's still a value in having translators because they are contributing to intercultural and international relations and understanding, which are more and more necessary in this world as it gets smaller, our world becomes more and more crowded, and as we destroy it at an increasing rate. We've got to start talking more and more to each other, not less and less. And learning foreign languages, knowing how to translate, how to interpret, ensuring that communication goes between people is essential for our very survival. So artificial intelligence is all well and good, and there's nothing bad about it at all that I can see, but it's not enough. We can't leave everything to the computer or to artificial intelligence, or we're lost. That's my view.
Muchas gracias, profesor. Sí, tiene toda la razón. Usted hizo una comparación muy interesante ahí, que las máquinas, un computador también puede dibujar, incluso hay software, programas que pueden escribir el resumen a partir de un artículo o incluso escribir un artículo, y eso no implica que vamos a acabar con los pintores o un programa puede hacer música y no vamos a acabar tampoco con los artistas, con los músicos. Muchas gracias. Muy bonito ese ejemplo. Antes de dar la palabra a Gustavo Zapata, un profesor muy importante de nuestra escuela de idiomas, le voy a dar la palabra primero a Elisa Galeano, estudiante de la maestría. Elisa, adelante.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Professor, for your touching contribution to our process. It's very, very moving for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Listening to you, I think about something, and I would like to ask you if it is possible to affirm that the translation competence would be like an inner seed that could emerge or develop in the person interested, if it is oriented by a humanized process of teaching.
Yes, yes, yes. I absolutely agree with you. I love the idea, the metaphor of a seed that can grow. It's sort of like, it may be even that the seed is quite conventional in its basic structure, but it has to point to new directions. Because a seed for a plant, for example, has information and genetic information that will allow the plant to get started. But then the plant is dependent on the environment, on the rain that comes in, on the sunlight that it gets, too much shade, too much dryness, too much moisture. But initially there is that basic information, which is maybe an introduction to things like learning. What is the learning all about? What does it mean to be a translator? What is translator competence? Where am I going in that sense? And this was asked earlier on. And I think those are objectives that one can focus on right from the beginning, like where am I basically going? Not in great detail, but a general direction so that I don't spend 4 or 5 years preparing for one thing. And then I find at the end, oh, I didn't want to do that at all. And then you start studying something else. But I very much like your idea of the seed metaphor. It's very, very nice.
Thanks a lot.
Bueno, ahora sí le voy a dar la palabra a Gustavo Zapata. Profesor Kirali, cuando yo decía que Gustavo es un profesor muy importante de la escuela, es porque es el profesor más antiguo en estos momentos, creo que de toda la universidad y obviamente del pregrado y de traducción de la Escuela de Idiomas. Además es traductor e intérprete oficial, inglés-español, español-inglés, y ha sido profesor de casi todos nosotros, ha sido un ejemplo y siempre, o sea, ha estado ahí para responder a nuestras preguntas, para aconsejarnos. Entonces, Gustavo, bienvenido y adelante con la pregunta.
Good morning, Dr. Kirali and everybody.
Good morning.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes.
All right. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm going to make a long story short because I know it's you must be tired. You've been talking for more than 1 hour. Thanks, Alejo, for your words. And yeah, I remember reading your interesting book, the Sociolinguistic Theory of Translation, and we read the book through and through, and it was very interesting, and I really enjoy that book, and also your the statements you make there about translation. Concerning your present points of view on translation, especially the thing about fractals, I remember it's interesting that this theory was born like in the 1970s, 1975, yes. Something like that.
Yes, right.
In the University of Antioquia, we had this professor of physics speaking about it widely around the university around the 1980s.
Oh, wow.
Nobody listened to him because it was a very weird thing. And like you said, we're in this trend, long history train of rigid process of step by step.
Yes.
So, and we still are prisoners of this system.
Right.
And I agree with Juan Guillermo. This is a big problem for our universities, where this is big tension between the central administration, especially even the central system in Bogota, and the local universities. There is like a grip. You get the funds. They provide the funds, and they set the rules.
Yes.
So it's a very rigid control of the state.
Yes.
And this is what we should try to, fight solve this problem of tension, and try to, in some way, get rid of it and try to get some more freedom.
Yes.
And that's what we're trying to do. Concerning the idea about the fractals, it's a simple question. I'm totally agree with this idea of setting a little of freedom in the curriculum of the courses, not being this step-by-step curriculum. And I, for a long time, I've been kind of sympathizer of chaos theory. And since fractals are a little bit close to, or are part of the chaos theory, how far are you from chaos theory? And why you don't talk about it?
Oh, I will be talking about it next week. So I haven't talked about it today because this was supposed to be the early Corrali period. And I discovered chaos theory and complexity theory around 2003, 2004, and then started working on them immediately because they seemed to lend themselves perfectly to where I was in my thinking at that time in terms of education. But I was not familiar with them before then. Since then, I found it to be a very fertile area for work, and I apply it all the time. Not so much chaos theory, but complexity theory. Yeah, but the related theories, I think, are all of tremendous value for understanding the world in terms of non-linear structures and processes, including the entire environmental domain, of course. So, and it's nice to get students to think in terms of who am I today and where I want to be tomorrow, but I don't have to worry about my past. I have to adjust to whatever I have brought along with me and make amends now and start learning something new. I find a lot of people get to a certain age and then they say, oh, I can't study anymore. I'm just too old for that. I'm already 22, 23. I can't study with 19-year-olds or 18-year-olds. But you can, and you can learn an awful lot on your own. I never studied translation, for example, and now I have a professorship in translation studies. You can do that kind of thing if you rely on your own intelligence and your own resources, your ability to do research and to ask and to seek out knowledge from more knowledgeable others. But it need not be sitting in a classroom that's created by someone else. I mean, I find value in classes too. I go to classes in Spanish online, but most of my learning I do by myself in between classes. And I wonder if students still have a feel for that. I get the feeling that a lot of students expect to get a lot of their learning in class. But I think most of our learning we do outside of classes, on our own, and in talking with others over a beer. For me, that's the source of my inspiration and actual real learning, significant learning, not in a classroom setting where someone's spoon feeding me something.
Yes, I think there is this need of debunking this old system of learning and class learning and trying to bring confusion to the students. make them understand that the world is a little bit chaotic and disorderly, and they have to adapt, and that's the idea.
Right. And that each one of them is an absolute individual and shouldn't compare himself or herself to everyone else. So what's she doing? What can she do? What can't I do? Because that can be so self-defeating. I find a great deal of strength in helping students feel good about themselves. Not when it's not justified, then I tend to wait for that, if something positive would come out of them. But then I like to zoom in and say, this is done well. This is a really good job. And to build them up or offer them an opportunity to work on another project or something that's paid or whatever it might be. And I find students respond really well to that. In the early years, I never thought of doing that. My job was in the classroom. And now I find that a lot of my work is done outside of the classroom, helping students with problems, research problems that they have, or self-motivation problems. And I find that I get through to a lot more students today than I did 25, 30 years ago, because I tend to treat them as individuals. And before, I think I saw them more as very similar to everyone else with the same problems. And I don't think that's the case anymore.
Thanks a lot, Dr.
You're welcome.
Muchas gracias, Gustavo. Bueno, yo creo que no hay más preguntas, a menos que alguien tenga una última pregunta. No veo más preguntas en el chat, tampoco veo manos levantadas.
Sí, buenos días.
Carlos Arturo, adelante.
Good morning, Donald Kirley and the rest of the participants here. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's a real pleasure to hear from you and to hear you, and just to remember so many things based on your book on 2000. Okay, I went just to refer to that book, especially to the representation of the mind based on your studies. I'm referring to the egg shape representation, in which you mentioned so many basic and interesting and inspiring concepts for translation studies and translation education. One of those concepts, which has been inspiring for different research groups. For example, in Barcelona, the research group PACTE, whose director Amparo Hurtado Albir, who was my teacher and director of my dissertation. Okay, this group, and in Brazil, of course, they saw concepts like relatively uncontrolled processes in translation, which was very inspiring for them just to work on different research areas. And there is another concept there in which I want just to refer to. The concept I want just to refer is a self-concept, translator's self-concept. I think this concept has been, let's say, mentioned in literature, but it has not been gone deeply. And of course, I don't know many things about this. Maybe I have read some aspects related to translator identity. My question is, do you know some studies which refer a little bit deeper on translator's self-concept and self-identity?
I actually know personally of one. This is the dissertation written by María del Mar Aro Soler at the University of Granada, and she completed it in 2019, and she just won the CIUT Prize, which is the Conference of Institutes of Translation and Interpreting Studies around the world. She received the prize for the best dissertation on interpreting and translation for 2019 on the basis of this study. It's 450 or 5 pages long, 450 or 500 pages long, and it's really outstanding because she's talking about self-efficacy beliefs. So one's own beliefs about how well one can perform in a professional setting as a translator. But she goes through the entire history of studies on the translator self-concept, and she, starting with my little book, and it was my 1995 book, actually, not the 2000 book, and that little picture that I included there, and I had a brief description of what I thought the translator self-concept might be. But she actually did research on it, and to quite some depth. And we also, the two of us, wrote an article on the same topic in 2020, which you can find online under ResearchGate. So María del Mar Aro Soler is her name, and this is the best study I've seen. But I think you're quite right. This concept has been ignored far too much, the translator self-concept. And I think it's an essential area for new research, and not many people are working on it yet, but should be.
Muchas gracias, profesor, por la respuesta.
Thank you.
Profesor, ¿cree usted que tenemos, do we have time for a last question, maybe?
Sure.
Ok, entonces, porque había otra pregunta en el chat, pero creo que esa pregunta yo creo que usted la va a responder en la charla de la próxima semana. Esa pregunta tenía que ver con, can you give more in-depth ideas on translation being a social process? Does it have to do with pragmatics? Yo creo que la próxima semana usted puede profundizar un poquito más en esto. Entonces, le voy a dar la palabra para una última pregunta a Mario, estudiante de la tercera cohorte de la maestría. Mario, adelante. Gracias.
Thank you, Alejandro. Professor Curry, thanks for the talk. You were talking about the linearity of study programs and how this creates a problem. People learn at different paces. But how do you check that students are learning? I mean, that they're advancing somehow. Is there anything that you say about that?
I have no way of avoiding this. I would really like to avoid it myself. I don't like the idea of being the person who has to judge someone else's performance, especially if they're in the process of learning and it's not at the end of their learning process. But I have to do it. The university insists that I do it. So I do set goals in conjunction with the students. For example, a deadline. Of course, a deadline comes from the project itself. I make sure that we have enough time for the students to get the job done, but then they have until the very last day to hand in their final project. And I give them options on how to get the work done, how to work in teams with other people, how to do the terminology management work, how to revise someone else's text in a proper manner and an effective manner. But then they have to get down to work and do it themselves. And what they have to do is hand in a high quality text. And I set arbitrarily a number of errors that they can have. And it comes out to be somewhere between 5 and 10 errors per page. Minor non-translation, basically binary errors that I can resolve quickly as a professional translator and native speaker of English. So, and I find that everyone, all of my students can reach that goal. So our students in this course do not have to get a grade. So I don't have to decide between A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, 4. I just have to decide on passing or not passing. For me, passing is a very decent level of accomplishment and work that I would accept from a new graduate translator in the business, in the commercial world. That's passing for me.
In terms of the product.
Sorry, it's based on the product.
Okay.
Yes, of course, there are other aspects that are included as well. For example, some of the students have to manage the project. They're the project management students. They must be ethical. They must know how to talk in a polite manner to the other students. They have to have a sense of etiquette in dealing with problems. They have to be ready to jump in when a problem arises and help out when another student gets sick, that kind of thing. So I take these factors into account as well, and I tell them at the beginning, I think these things are important to learn too. And do you want me to include them or not? And invariably they say yes. But I have German students. German students tend to be very proficiency and competence oriented, and they want to do a good job. They don't want to get by easily. So I've been lucky, again, being in that particular environment for my whole career. So I could well be spoiled, but I don't have to pressure them at all. They want to do a good job. They want to succeed, and they'll put in extra hours as long as I'm in the background to help a little bit, to nudge them, to guide them a little bit. They are willing to put in that extra effort and get done on time and produce translations of at a professional level of quality. So I've been very happy with that approach and have not had to make a rigid application of rules for grading decision. I don't want to do that, and I've resisted all along. And the university has kept very quiet on that. I haven't had any complaints.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
But this is fair.
Hay como una interferencia por ahí. Antes de despedirnos, yo les quiero recordar que la próxima semana vamos a encontrarnos de nuevo con los estudiantes de la maestría por esta sala de Zoom y con los profesores del pregrado de traducción y de la maestría de traducción. El encuentro va a ser un poco más temprano porque tendremos 4 presentaciones muy interesantes y la última de esas presentaciones va a ser la del profesor Kirali en español, cuyo título es ¿Cómo sería una enseñanza emergente de la traducción? Y va a ser un complemento de su presentación de hoy y de todo lo que hemos venido discutiendo. Así que, por favor, las personas que nos ven a través del canal de la Escuela de Idiomas están cordialmente invitados, pueden hacer sus preguntas después de las 4 presentaciones. Y también quiero decirles antes de despedirnos que, como decimos, acaba de salir del horno el último número de la revista Mutatis Mutandis, es el número 1 del volumen 14, se llama Traducción y Prensa en América Latina y el Caribe, pasado, presente y futuro. Lo pueden consultar, yo les dejé el link en el chat del canal de la Escuela de Idiomas. Entonces, pues, no queda más que agradecer a todos los participantes y agradecer sobre todo la bondad que ha tenido el profesor Kirali para conectarse con nosotros hoy desde Alemania y iluminarnos, darnos un poquito de todo lo que él ha vivido, lo que ha experimentado como profesor, no solamente de traducción, sino también de lenguas. Y de verdad, profesor, que le agradecemos de todo corazón por su bondad y por haber estado aquí con nosotros y responder a todas nuestras inquietudes. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much for the invitation to and for this tremendous opportunity. It's always great to exchange ideas. So thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Muchas gracias, profesor. Son las 11 en punto. Cumplimos con el cronograma que teníamos para el día de hoy. Recuerden que están cordialmente invitados para la conferencia que tendremos la próxima semana. Un feliz día para todos. Muchas gracias y buen fin de semana.
Thank you very much.